Welcome to the All Facts Matter podcast, where we push back against corporate media propaganda with facts, evidence, and data. I'm Peter, the author of All Facts Matter. Let's begin. Between Wednesday's Consumer Price Index summary and yesterday's Producer Price Index summary, one not very pleasant conclusion is unavoidable. Inflation is rising once more. With Donald Trump not even through the first full month of his second term of office, the surge of inflation could not have come at a worse time. Rising consumer prices complicates his economic strategy of using tariffs as a sort of universal cudgel to press other countries to align their policies more with American interests. This has always been one of the potential vulnerabilities within President Trump's proposed strategy of negotiating via tariffs. Shifting price levels, and in particular a sustained high rate of inflation, could very quickly make Trump's tariffs economically very costly, not just to the United States, but to the global economy. Yet the exposure of the global economy to inflationary pressures could make other countries more vulnerable to the pricing consequences of Trump's tariffs. The perverse timing of inflation rising now could either push Trump's tariffs completely off the economic and political stage, or make them a primary influence in the shape of the global economy during President Trump's term of office. What is particularly remarkable about this uptick in consumer price inflation is that nearly all categories of goods and services showed at least some increase in the inflation rate. There was no holdout sector, no bright spot or hopeful area where consumer prices were declining. Both headline inflation and core inflation year on year rose, with headline inflation rising on an unadjusted basis from 2.8% to 3% year on year, and core inflation ticking up to 3.2%. Both headline and core inflation rose month on month as well. In the unadjusted data, the month on month increase was the largest it had been for the past year, for both headline and core inflation. This increase was to be expected, however, as all major sub-indices showed an increase, including energy price inflation. And food price inflation also surged in January. Food prices rose in January of 2025 very nearly as much as they rose in January of 2024. Given where food price inflation has been in the past, that is not at all a good thing. Within core inflation, even housing prices took a hit, with rent of shelter posting a fairly substantial increase in month-on-month inflation to 0.46%. Durable goods flipped from deflation to inflation in January, as did non-durable goods. And even services notched a noticeable month-on-month increase. It is no exaggeration to say that inflation rose literally everywhere. The breadth of the rise alone makes the uptick difficult to dismiss as a statistical aberration in a larger disinflationary trend. The January data may end up being exactly that, but surely we can be forgiven for thinking that this feels like something more. Corporate media, of course, naturally indulged its eternal obsession with all things Trump and made the inflation reporting primarily about President Trump. CNN chose to declare inflation to be President Trump's problem, rather than, say, America's problem. Ironically, CNN was so intent on mocking Donald Trump for his overtly political messaging on Truth Social about Bidenflation rising that they decided not to make him the inflation-causing boogeyman corporate media made him out to be during last year's election cycle. The likelihood that CNN will still believe this to be true in a few months, when it will want to blame all inflation and whatever else CNN can dream up on President Trump, is approximately nil. Newsweek decided to snark about Donald Trump's campaign rhetoric regarding bringing down inflation on day one. That Donald Trump was not even president for most of January rather takes away from the sarcastic sting Newsweek was no doubt intending. Now, the inflation numbers are relevant to President Trump, of course, as they will directly impact how well his tariff strategies will work and what the domestic impact those strategies will have. For his part, President Trump has maintained since the election a rhetorical position he had initially staked out during the election. Getting inflation under control will take pushing energy prices still lower and making supply chains more resilient. I would claim to be disappointed in corporate media for their Trump oriented focus when reporting the largest monthly increase in consumer price inflation for months, but that would require expecting better of them. And longtime followers already know I have no such expectations of the corporate media. One significant aspect of inflation's rise in the United States that corporate media has largely glossed over is that it is not an isolated occurrence. Consumer price inflation is rising on a global basis. Inflation has been rising in Europe for the past few months. And inflation has been rising recently in Asia as well. And even China has seen an uptick in inflation. China no doubt welcomes a surge in prices, as it is a sign the country may yet avoid a deflationary lost decade. Even Japan is ambivalent about inflation surge, as it has been grappling with persistent deflation also for decades. Unfortunately for Donald Trump, the one place where inflation is not on the rise outside of the United States is North America. Both Canada and Mexico have experienced monthly drops in their inflation numbers for the past few months. While North America remains an economic outlier on inflation, at least for now, the rest of the world is largely experiencing a significant increase in consumer price inflation. This global rise in inflation makes corporate media's fixation on Donald Trump faintly absurd. For a global phenomenon, one generally looks for a global cause, not a local one. The American president is quite capable of influencing inflation rates in the United States with spending and economic policies, but even the American president is going to have only limited capacity to influence inflation rates halfway around the globe. Wall Street analysts do see a potential global driver to the current global increase in inflation, however. Global supply chains are, once again, exhibiting signs of duress. This super squeeze scenario is, in the eyes of Wall Street, a convergence of forces, including geopolitical risk from the ongoing wars in Ukraine as well as between Israel and Hamas, and the residual shipping disruptions from the Houthis' year-long pattern of attacking cargo ships transiting the Red Sea heading to or from the Suez Canal. The relative scarcity of many commodities is also being blamed on underinvestment in resource development, as demand for several metals is being pushed up by interest in so-called green technologies and the desire of many countries to move away from using fossil fuels for energy. Given the increase in these energy transition metals, Wall Street believes that investment levels in developing known deposits of these metals have simply not kept pace with demand. And when demand outpaces supply, prices will rise. If this is part of what is driving inflation currently, then January may be only the beginning of another inflationary cycle. Developing new mineral deposits or expanding extraction of existing deposits can take years to complete. If the level of investment in commodities development has been lagging, even with a remedial level of investment, it could be some years before supply can rise enough to meet rising demand. Is the super squeeze scenario real? Ultimately, this is Wall Street's take on what is happening within commodities markets. However, what is happening in commodities markets is that prices are rising. Copper has been climbing steadily since the beginning of January. And even non mineral commodities such as lumber are rising. And even food price inflation has a global element to it, as the price of wheat and grain futures has also been going up. This may or may not constitute a super squeeze scenario, but commodity prices are unquestionably rising right now, and rising everywhere, as commodity indices illustrate. Of course, oil prices also surged in early January, and by month's end still had not dropped back down to January's opening price. At a minimum, the super squeeze scenario does give a credible explanation for the across the board rise in commodities prices, which fundamentally mirrors the across the board rise in consumer prices. Far less certain, however, is the extent to which these price appreciation trends are likely to last. In the super squeeze scenario, energy transition metals in particular are likely to command elevated prices for potentially years, which translates into potentially years of elevated consumer price inflation. If peace should at last prevail in Ukraine and in the Middle East, on the other hand, a number of commodity prices might actually come down. In many respects, yesterday's producer price index summary goes a long way towards bolstering the super squeeze scenario in commodities. As with the consumer price index, the producer price index charted rising factory gate inflation seemingly everywhere. Energy, goods, food, services. As with the CPI, the PPI rose across the board. Now, the PPI measures what is often described as factory gate inflation, while the CPI looks at the prices actually paid by consumers for various goods and services. The producer price index measures the prices actually sought by producers of various goods and services. Because the producer price index is focused more on the producer side of the economic equation, it is broadly presumed to serve as a leading indicator for the consumer price index, with price changes as reflected in the producer price index often being replicated in the consumer price index a few months into the future. If that is the case, we could very well be looking at a period of rising prices that will extend for the next several months at least. Perhaps more crucially, if global supply chains are under duress, then prices are going to be pushed up globally as well. Inflation will be not just an issue in the United States, but worldwide. At the same time, should Donald Trump be successful in getting Russia and Ukraine to end their war, or if the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas should hold and bring that conflict to an end as well, some of the major causes of supply chain strain might be alleviated within coming months. The super squeeze scenario might prove to be the most optimistic scenario for inflation globally over the coming year. With prices rising more or less globally, perhaps the greatest unknown variables are possible future Trump tariffs. What seems certain is that President Trump is not giving any indication that a global trend of rising prices is dissuading him from pursuing his tariff agenda. Even as the producer price index printed rising factory gate inflation yesterday, Trump signed a presidential memorandum committing to reciprocal tariffs on countries which impose tariffs on U.S. goods or otherwise engage in trade practices the United States considers to be unfair. The concerns of many, if not most economists, that tariffs are themselves a driver of inflation has not translated into any reluctance on Trump's part to pursue the tariff strategy he described on the campaign trail last fall. If supply chains are being strained, adding an additional burden of tariffs could quite easily have a dramatic and not at all benign impact on consumer prices. A period of rising prices could give President Trump's tariffs an inflationary effect that was not observed in 2018, when Trump added a number of tariffs on U.S. trade partners without sparking a major rise in consumer prices. Despite a rising potential for Trump's tariffs to produce renewed consumer price inflation, even corporate media is beginning to believe that at least some of the tariffs Trump is proposing, or contemplating, could be beneficial to the United States, at least in the near term. Some commodity analysts even view Trump's tariffs as possibly spurring, within the United States at least, the additional investment needed to mitigate supply chain pain over the longer term. Increased investment in the United States following the imposition of tariffs in 2018 would be one reason why a number of consumer and import prices continue to fall even after the tariffs came into effect. However, the signature difference between 2018 and the present is that prices were not rising globally in 2018. To the contrary, import prices in the United States remained in a deflationary trend that had started some 3 or 4 years earlier and continued until just before the COVID pandemic panic nonsense. That change in inflationary outlook is almost certain to have significant impact on how any tariffs imposed by President Trump are received by the world. Inflation could make countries hit with tariffs sufficiently discomfited as to motivate them to negotiate alternative trade relationships with the United States that eliminated or reduced those tariffs. At the same time, inflation could make Trump's tariffs particularly costly for the United States and perhaps even disadvantage the U.S. in negotiating better trade relationships globally. What seems certain is that many of the economic assumptions that lay underneath Trump's anticipated tariff strategy are being either altered or invalidated by resurgent global price inflation. While inflation is poised to make President Trump's economic policies ever more consequential than before, it is also poised to make those policies even more problematic than they were before. And that concludes this presentation. I hope you found this podcast helpful and informative. Please like it and share this with your friends. Word of mouth is how I publicize my work. Please also consider making a one-time donation or becoming a paid subscriber to All Facts Matter. Your support is what keeps this work going, and I greatly appreciate all of my subscribers. Without you, this work would have no meaning. I encourage everyone to be especially generous with feedback. Leave a word or two in the comment section so that we can keep the discussion going and that we may learn from each other. Thank you all for listening, and have a nice day.